So you are now in charge. You and Brent are now in charge, and we will try to behave.
Yeah, right.
So, so Robert,
you are now in charge. You
No,
and
I
Brent
get it,
are
I get
now
it,
in
I get
charge,
it, I
and we
get it.
will try to behave.
Yeah, right.
Robert, thank you, as always, for doing this. I hope you might take maybe 3 to 5 minutes to really.
So Robert, you are now in charge. You and Brent are now in charge, and we will try to behave.
Yeah, right.
I think I need to stop anyway, Robert, you there?
Yeah, I'm right here.
Can you talk maybe 3 to 5 minutes about Moore Square before we, get into this? In some senses,
Sure.
it's a little bit related to it. The Sunday school class has been talking about what it might be like to participate as a congregation in Moore Square. And
Sure.
I think you have some perspective as somebody who helped started it and somebody who was a pastor of a congregation that was participating in it.
Sure. More Squared, it's a strange name for an organization, but More Squared is Moree. Well, they took the E and put a 2 above it, like squared. Like 4 squared is 16. And More Squared is Metro Organization for Racial and Economic Equity. Metro Organization for Racial and Economic Equity. And it's founded on the thesis that the whole metro needs to bind together and care for each other and look out for each other's mutual interest, because that's the way that our whole metro will survive. It's a community organizing group that consists of member congregations who pay dues that are pretty modest, I believe. They're not, but that's my perspective of being a longtime member of More Squared. It was begun in the summer of '84 and it chartered in September with, according to one myth or another, 11 congregations or 12 congregations. And they were on both sides of the state line and now are continuing to grow over 30 congregations since it was founded. Last year was its 20th anniversary, and we had a big celebration down at what is called the Lex, which is kind of the basement of the convention center. And it was a great celebration, and I think almost over 600 people in attendance. And what we do is we do issue cuts, if you will. During its first year of existence, we did issues assemblies, and congregations did what we call one-on-ones. These are one-on-one conversations, pretty deep, not probing into anybody's personal life, but into what people really care about. What are their highest values? And we considered that good living wage jobs, healthcare, and education were our primary foci. And that has remained true. It's not the only things that More Squared cares about, but they're among the best and the most principal. More Squared wrote the RFP. If you know what an RFP is, that's a request for a proposal. We wrote the RFP for the Kit Bond Bridge, or what became the Kit Bond Bridge. What's significant about that? Well, what we said was all this building boom that was going on in Kansas City was not benefiting women and minority construction workers, as it should, because these are public dollars and you should hire people locally, and you should hire people that need to be pulled up and pulled forward and advanced, not just in a job, but a career. And we wrote a 30% MBE, WBE, and workforce contingent in that RFP, and we won. We won the RFP, and by the way, all those numbers were met, and that meant careers for these new construction workers that had previously been left out and shunned and excluded from the unions and their pathway to construction careers. At any rate, that's just one small thing that it has done over the years. We have monthly board meetings. They're both Zoom and in person. It's an open book about the budget. There's nobody pulling strings. We have both the when we file for sunshine under the sunshine provisions of Missouri state governance, we have sometimes gotten the ire of some public officials when we've said, hey, we want to see what were those people talking about when they cut that deal in smoke-filled back rooms. But the main thing is relationships, building relationships with one another, and helping each congregation live out its commitment to justice. Metro Organization for Racial and Economic Equity. And those are justice concerns. Okay?
So Robert, one last take here. As somebody who has some sense of our congregation and been involved in many of these Great Souls, Great Prayers, what's the opportunity for First Christian Church of Independence? How would you encourage us to think about it and evaluate the opportunity?
Well, I'd ask, now this is not meant to be in any way edgy. This is just something to consider. We Christians say, everybody says that they're about justice. What we mostly do is mercy, and that's a great thing. The world needs more and more mercy. But More Squared could be, for you and for any congregation that joins, a real way to make justice real. And if you say that you're committed to justice, this is a way to do it really publicly and effectively. More Squared is not about just venting. We're going to have a quote by Samuel Proctor later on that you'll really like. And More Squared lives by this quote. And it's too far down in my slide deck and my notes, I can't give it to you. But when we get there, I'll say, this is the More Squared quote, okay? And just remember that when we get to that part.
All right, well, let me get it going here.
There we go. By the way, I want to thank you, and I've put my thank you on the very first slide. I should have been doing this all along to show where this is happening and how you all at First Christian Church are on the cutting edge of these kinds of conversations. And by the way, I mean all across the nation. I want to thank you for the invitation, for the encouragement. I'm noting that no chocolates were sent to 121 West 48th Street, but I'm sure that Brent will tell me how delicious they were, and Liz will tell me how wonderful they were. But I'm telling you now that you all are wonderful by your invitation for me to do this. And so I'm from now on, every time we do one of these sessions, I will ascribe your all's name on the very first slide. We're dealing with Samuel DeWitt Proctor, who grew up in Norfolk, Virginia, born on the 13th of July, 1921. And here's a picture of his father, Herbert, his mother, Velma, and his great-grandmother, Hattie Fisher. And you'll see as we go along how important Virginia Union College was and is to this family. But Hattie, the picture on the far right, on the upper right-hand corner, graduated in 1882. And it is a historic Black college and university, HBCU. And she graduated. She was born in slavery, but her family and her own intestinal fortitude saw to it that she was going to get a college degree, and she did. Her parents did, her grandparents all did, He would grow up with 5 siblings and his 2 parents at 918 Fremont Street. And this is a picture of his house, that white wood frame house that was built by students from Hampton Institute, from which his grandmother would graduate, not Virginia Union, but Hampton Institute. And it was built under the supervision of his grandfather. He tells great stories, Sam does, with folk wisdom and everything. And he has a great kind of recounting of how Black people have been in the construction business for a long, long time. And he tells a great story about how the students at Hampton built this house under his grandfather's supervision. He skips the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th grades, partly because his family was so hepped up on reading and learning. His father would memorize poetry, knew Dunbar, knew Longfellow, knew the Wordsworth, knew these great poets. And he had an educated family that he grew up in. He joined, or he didn't join, but he joined the Bank Street Baptist Church, but he wasn't baptized until much later. The Bank Street Church is there on the right, graduates from Booker T. Washington High School at the age of 15 in 1937. Now, when he was growing up, not only was there reading and poetry and arts, but there was music. And all 6 of the children in the household he grew up in, including himself, were required to take music lessons. Sam took clarinet lessons and piano lessons. So it was no surprise to the family that he won a music scholarship to Virginia State College, which is pictured on the right, the first picture at the top. And he was playing saxophone in a jazz band and in the music program there at Virginia State. While attending church services in Petersburg, Virginia, he hears a sermon based on Joshua 1:9 and experiences something very strange, something unseen working in him. And he is baptized very shortly thereafter. And the picture of that church on the right with the wraparound balcony, with the red everywhere, replete in the carpet and the pews, is where he heard that sermon. He becomes a member of the Kappa Alpha Psi. I'm sorry about the misspelling. I'll get that on the corrected version, Brent, later. But the Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity, and I'm not sure if you know how important what are called the Divine Nine are to Black Americans and also international folk as well. But Kappa Alpha Psi is one of the Divine Nine. The network of connections, the intricate relationships, friendships, bonds of fellowship that are enjoyed in fraternities across the country is very, very important. And it's not an elitist thing. I couldn't become a part of a fraternity when I was at TCU. I'm an OAF, AAF. You know what that is. Once a frog, always a frog, right? But I wasn't ever a member of a fraternity because I couldn't afford the dues. I couldn't afford to be a member of fraternity. But Kappa Alpha Psi was Proctor's fraternity, and he was proud of that all of his life. He takes an exam in 1939 for the U.S. Naval Apprentice School. He goes to work for the U.S. Navy as a shipfitter apprentice. In 1940, he hears a call to ministry and enrolls in Virginia Union College, which is pictured in the lower right-hand corner there. He marries Bessie Louise Tate, and you see her in the 2 pictures at the top, and they will have 4 sons. Now, this is very interesting. This is very unusual. Herbert and Timothy, the first two sons, are pictured in the first picture. And then Samuel and Stephen are pictured in the second picture. Those two pairs of sons, if you will, they're not twins, but those two pairs of sons, between the second and the third son, there was a 13-year gap. And I don't know when Samuel was born, did they say, well, his older brothers are on their way to college and, or will soon be on their way to college, Timothy will, and he'll have nobody in the home. So did they have a second child, Stephen? Perhaps. But I could never get a picture and with all of them together. And then my friend Marvin McMickle told me why about that 13-year gap. He gets an AB degree. That's a bachelor's degree in language and literature. That's no surprise. In 1942, and he attends University of Pennsylvania for a year. I think probably his idea was that he would be a college professor or an administrator, which he would become. But in 43, he kind of heard called to ministry, and he enters Crozier Theological Seminary, which is in Chester, Pennsylvania. And he becomes what are called one of the Sons of Calvary under the leadership of J. Pius Barber, who's pictured there in the middle, who was the pastor at Calvary Baptist Church, I believe, for 40 years. He was the pastor when a guy named William Augustus Jones, a man with a voice only like God, only deeper, it was said. And he was a great, great pastor in Brooklyn for 40 years himself. He was there when Dr. King enrolled in Crozier and went to seminary there. His King's Daddy King, knew Barber and kind of sent him up there to take care of him under the tutelage, under the kind of auspices of J. Pius Barber. And Sam went there too. He was one of the Sons of Calvary. This cannot be overestimated, the impact of this man, J. Pius Barber. He was a great preacher. And he would critique the preaching of those people that were preaching in the congregation, Timothy's and younger folks that were coming up. And he would critique them about the introduction, the content, and then the climax or the celebration, if you will. And he would do that immediately after the service was over. That would be very daunting. Ask Reverend Mondane if he would like to have had that when he was young, to be so critically critiqued. He's ordained in 1943 and 1945. He gets his bachelor degree, which is comparable to the MDiv now from Crozier. He accepts a fellowship to go study at Yale, which is featured in the lower right-hand corner. And why did he do this? He just keeps jumping from one institution to another. Well, when he was at Crozier, he did some Sunday school teaching at Calvary Baptist Church under Barber, but he had no invitations to become pastor. He had no interviews to get a job. And so he said, well, I'll just go study at Yale, maybe longer. But then came an invitation by the Pond Street Baptist Church in Providence, Rhode Island, and he went there. He quit Yale because his
Robert, we lost you.
In 1946. He obtains his PhD in theology, called a THD, and his doctorate from Boston in 1950, and he joins the faculty at Virginia Union, and he quickly goes up the ladder. He becomes dean of its divinity school. He will meet Dr. King when Dr. King is at Crozier Seminary, and Dr. Proctor is asked back to speak on campus there at Crozier. He becomes the pastor of Gillfield Baptist Church in Petersburg, Virginia, and it's pictured right to your immediate right of that sentence. He'll travel to India and Burma. His renown as a preacher is becoming known, and he becomes even president at the age of 34 of Virginia Union, then college, eventually university. In 1956, and this is no small thing either, he will go down and give a series of lectures at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, Montgomery, Alabama. What's going on then? The Montgomery bus boycott. It had started in December after Rosa Parks refused to get up from her seat, and she will be in attendance, I'm sure, at some of these lectures, and he will apply what he knows about theology and religion and the New Testament and the whole Bible to the situation right there in Alabama. He has a front row seat to that extraordinary time in civil rights history. Next slide. He does a preaching mission in Moscow, and then in 1960, he becomes president of North Carolina A&T. This is Agricultural and Technical State University. So he has become president of one higher education institution in 55, and in 1960, he's the president of another institution. He knew how to run educational institutions, and he was great at it. And here he also has another front row seat. He will meet Jesse Jackson, who's president of the student body and quarterback of the football team at NCAT. And he will also witness the sit-in movement that's going on in North Carolina. In 1962, Sergeant Shriver, who's pictured with him in front of that world map, will ask him to do a recruiting and training of new Peace Corps volunteers, especially in Nigeria, which he does. And in Nigeria is where his son, the second sons are born in Nigeria. He resumes duties as president of NCAT and A&T University in September of 63, but then resigns in 64 to become associate director of the Peace Corps and also general secretary of the National Council of Churches. Just about 8 months later, he becomes the Northeast Regional Director of the Office of Economic Opportunity. And here he is with President Kennedy and also Benjamin Mays, who was the president of Morehouse College at that time. In 68, he's asked to and writes speeches for Hubert Humphrey's presidential campaign. In 68, he becomes University Dean for Special Programs in Wisconsin at the university there. In 69, he is appointed the MLK Memorial Professor in the School of Education at Rutgers University. And in 1972, he assumes the pulpit of one of the greatest churches in America. He succeeds Reverend Adam Clayton Powell as senior pastor of the 18,000-member Abyssinian Baptist Church. Now, the word megachurch has been used wide and far, right? And we know all about that. We normally picture them doing contemporary music only, and that there may or may not be an emphasis upon the prosperity gospel, or they just may have a new way of being church, and it scares the bejesus out of most mainline Protestant churches. But large African-American churches have been going on in America long before the word mega church was ever coined. This is a picture of Dr. Proctor preaching. I think it's on an Easter Sunday. You can see the balcony filled to the rafters, as it were. Every seat is taken on the sanctuary floor. This is the exterior of the church. Doesn't do it justice, but it's a fantastic edifice. And then the picture in the lower right-hand corner has two of the greatest preachers of, well, three, Dr. Proctor. Then Marvin McMickle is the man, the tall man in the middle. And then the man on the far right is Calvin Butts, who would be on staff there, and Marvin McMickle would too, for several years. And Calvin would eventually become the senior pastor. He would be kind of anointed by Dr. Proctor to do so. And Dr. McMickle would go on to have a storied career and great preaching ministry in Cleveland, and then eventually become president of Colgate Rochester Crozier Seminary in Rochester, New York. It's no small thing. Look at that date down there, January 15th, 1978. That's Martin Luther King's birthday, and Dr. King's birthday was not yet a national holiday, but on that day, he has his first heart attack. A few of you in the class, I'm certain, are thinking, if you're not saying it out loud, no wonder, I'm not surprised, given how fast he lived and how many jobs he had. He had this job at Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, New York, at the same time that he is applying his educational expertise at Rutgers University. I thought you'd like to see that he delivered Count Basie's eulogy, and here is the Count lying in state at Abyssinian, and with Cab Calloway and Mayor Koch, New York City's mayor, in attendance, and nobody could do anything but smile when they thought about Count Basie. In '84, he's named by Ebony Magazine as one of the 15 greatest Black preachers. In 1985, Leonard Sweet, who had been at Drew University and the Drew Divinity School, he is president of United Theological Seminary in Dayton, Ohio, and he approaches Dr. Proctor about establishing a Doctor of Ministry program, and eventually they do this. In '85, they begin, and he creates a doctoral, it's not a mill, but some of the greatest preachers in the African-American Black church community across the United States got their D-Min at United. It's quite a thing to be a Proctor Fellow. And but Otis Moss III, as well as Freddie Haynes, as well as Johnny Ray Youngblood, many of these great Black preachers got their D-Min at Dayton at the United Theological Seminary as a Proctor Fellow. He retires in '89 after 17 years at Abyssinian Baptist Church, and he also retires from Rutgers. He has a heart event that precipitates a quadruple bypass surgery. He gives the Lyman Beecher lectures, which will become the wonderful book called How Shall They Hear? I recommend it to all preachers. I need to reread it, I'm sure. In 1990, the first class of the Proctor Fellows graduates, and then he is a visiting professor at universities like Duke, Vanderbilt, Howard, Harvard, Yale, all across the United States. He retires. That picture, go back to that picture of retirement. That picture of retirement there is, that's Calvin Butts, who's going to succeed him, giving him a gift and congratulating him upon his retirement. And the Ethiopian theme, which is another word for Abyssinian, if you will, is replete all throughout Abyssinian's architecture. And you can even see the Ethiopian Coptic cross there on the chancel in front of the seat where Dr. Proctor would sit many a Sunday. Next slide. He becomes the founding pastor in residence at the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Institute for Child Advocacy. Now that's a mouthful, right? But this is at the Children's Defense Fund Alex Haley Farm in Clinton, Tennessee. Alex Haley, the author of Roots, he bequeathed his farm to the Children's Defense Fund. Later on, we'll see a picture of Marion Wright Edelman, who would gather people there. And these are leaders who are going to go back to their communities and teach what they know about the importance of education, nurture, and the like. During this time, Dr. Proctor promotes a thing called the National Youth Academy, NYA. It never got off the ground to my knowledge, and it certainly is not active now, but he thought that there was over 1.5 million parentless homes where children didn't have parents at all taking care of them, and that we needed to lift while we climb, and that people who were achieving and blessed and situated such to provide places and learning and upbringing for these parentless children. So this was a natural for him to help Marion Wright Edelman. He's at the lectern doing morning devotions here in the picture at the top. Then there's the picture of all the people being trained. And then this is the big house and the meeting place on the lower right. He will serve as visiting and adjunct professor, United Theological Seminary, Boston, and Virginia Union, all in 1997. The picture to the right is him preaching at Duke, and there is a good repository of sermons, of videos of his sermons there. He suffers a heart attack in Iowa, at Mount Vernon, Iowa, at Cornell College, and he dies at the hospital there in Mercy Medical Center in Cedar Rapids the next day. His funeral is held, of course, at Abyssinian, and this is him lying in state with ushers and passersby and people coming to pay their respects. The president of the School of Theology is in attendance at this service, and he had died just 7 days before this moment. And the president of Virginia Union announces that its School of Theology, its divinity school, its seminary will change its name to the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology. And he announces that in the service. Marvin McMickle told me this bit of trivia that I did not know, and I can only imagine that there was thunderous applause in the congregation when it was announced. In 2003, a very significant event happens. The Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference is founded on September the 17th. And this is a gathering. You see a picture of some of the leaders. And in this picture on the far right is Freddie Haynes. 2 over from him is Jim Forbes. The woman in the black shirt and collar is Tracy Blackman. And a huge number of luminaries of Black leaders across the country found this institution that will meet on an annual basis and deliver academic papers, will gather for fellowship and inspiration, to conjoin, to unite sound biblical knowledge and committed social advocacy in Proctor's memory. And then in 2019, Rutgers will open its Samuel DeWitt Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice at the same time that they will do an endowed professorship, a chair in Dr. Proctor's honor. And he becomes the first African-American who has a chair endowed, fully endowed at a school of education. Where do we start with regard to books? Well, there are three principal ones that I would suggest to you. The two on the left at the top are memoir-like, The Substance of Things Hoped For, and also My Moral Odyssey. I would pick either one of those. Liz, if you have to get one for the library and only one, get the one on the far left, The Substance of Things Hoped For. He is a great writer, Dr. Proctor is, and a wonderful storyteller. And you'll profit by having that in your library. Then there's The Certain Sound of the Trumpet, about sermon writing and crafting and construction and its power in our midst. But How Shall They Preach is another good book down there. We did Gardner C. Taylor, remember? We've done Gardner Taylor, and he wrote a book with Dr. Taylor. We Have This Ministry, The Heart of the Pastor's Vocation. It's a great book too. I love this new book, The Imposing Preacher by Adam L. Bond, and he is at Virginia Union School of Theology, and he had access to many of the papers and the intricate details of Dr. Proctor's life. Next slide. Here are just a few of Proctor's memorable quotes, and we're coming up on the More Squared quote, okay? I'm just giving you a heads up here. But I love this quote about his forebears. When I think about my grandparents making the giant step from slavery to freedom, I realize that none of my own achievements can ever live up to their legacy. Even though everything in the law and the society claimed they were inferior, through all the long days and long nights of being beaten back, they held their heads high and made their mark. The lesson I learned early from observing and listening and trying to construct my own philosophy and pattern of life was very simple. It was a way of seeing the stars rather than the canopy of darkness. And he does that and says that and writes that surely in memory of Hattie Fisher, his grandmother pictured there. I liked his humility as he tells it. Intellectual depth is revealed in more subtle ways than simply reminding the people of how bereft of learning they are. Do you ever hear somebody where you think, you know, that man is thinking or that woman is thinking, you're really stupid, aren't you, audience? I'm going to educate you. I'm going to elucidate you. He never did that. In his stories, in his winsome folk wisdom, he would win over people and impart great intellectual depth and great high standards. But he would do it in a way that didn't kind of remind them that they were bereft of the learning that he had. He never did that. I think he reminds us well, when we have all competed to become wealthy, the preacher reminds us that we have an obligation to feed the hungry and to care for the widows and orphans, that we are only stewards of God's wealth. Now, that's a mercy statement, right? This next one is the More Squared quote, and this is how More Squared operates. There can be no peace without justice, but we must pursue both without adding to the problem by engaging in inflammatory rhetoric that exacerbates an already polarized situation. More Squared, as we had talked about at the top of this session, it avoids inflammatory rhetoric and doesn't want to exacerbate a polarized situation, but wants to pursue both peace and justice. Here are some sermon resources that I would commend to you, and some of them are just immediately available on YouTube, but others you can go to this repository at Duke, and it has a lot of his sermons there, I think 6 or 7. And the one that I love, The Cosmic Intervention of God, at the very end of it, he tells, it sounds like a real highfalutin title, right? And I suppose it is. Great text out of Luke. But at the end, he does this cataloging of his family life that is just wonderful. about how God's presence was attendant to the progress of his family's growth and his own personal development. The sermon at the bottom at St. Paul's Baptist Church is kind of a church anniversary sermon, and it's set in Richmond. He would have preached at this church. He knew the pastor well. And this is kind of Sam Proctor in his element. But it's about a very heavy and central issue on having a personal encounter with Christ. Now, you may from time to time hear me preach in a fashion that is very much not the style of Dr. Proctor, but it's got a way of preaching that is very typical in the African-American homiletical tradition. And that is, he would announce this. I want to talk this morning on the thought on having a personal encounter with Christ. And then he would list the text or read the text, and then you're off to the races. I like that way of preaching, and that is a very typical way in the African-American pulpit of preaching. It's not very typical for white preachers, and there are many preachers that eschew giving titles to sermon. I think it's very important to have a title. Anyway, I'd be interested in Reverend Mondane's take on that, and we can either debate or share a common grounding in that. I don't know. Next slide. Here are some things that are not necessarily sermonic, although the one in the middle, "These bones can live," is basically a sermon. It's an address, if you will, but it's really a sermon that he gives at the Haley Farm in 1996. There's an interview, "The Ties That Bind," that's very good. "The Future Is Now" is a wonderful lecture that he gives at Medgar Evers College in 1993. But don't neglect the 8-minute long video that Abyssinian Baptist Church, it's down at the bottom, they did on the occasion of his 100th birthday, posthumously, of course. Next slide. And then there are these sources that are where you can read, they're not video, but you can read his obituary in the Greensboro News and Record. This wonderful resource for preachers, Getting Started, the Basics for Sermon Preparation. I believe it's about 5 pages long, but it's wonderful. I mean, it's absolutely exquisite. The Samuel Proctor Conference, any of you who are interested in going to that, it's going to be in Little Rock, Arkansas, and I'm thinking about going. It's not cheap. I think it's $450 plus hotel, but you will, if you were to go, and also your transportation and food and all, but it is, I'm thinking about going myself. I've never been, and I've always wanted to, and it may be the closest it ever comes to Kansas City. And then there's a presence of the Proctor Conference on Facebook, and I've provided you the link. The next thing is a clip called the Scratch Line, and let's hear this, and you'll hear his voice, you'll hear his folk wit wisdom, and you'll hear something that can be interpreted a couple of ways, and we'll talk about that at the very end in the Q&A.
This is how to get in shape fast.
If you want to drop this, start eating more of these.
We do not all start at the same scratch line, although there's one original position hypothetically for everybody. You were born here owning nothing.
Brett, there's no.
Born.
Do you have a video?
Yeah, give me a second here.
Okay. I'm not sure if other people were seeing a black screen or not, but I didn't see the video. I'm hearing. Here we go.
We do not all start at the same scratch line, although there's one original position hypothetically for everybody. You were born here owning nothing, having earned nothing, just born. There you are, helpless, and you're a debtor to everybody. But some of us opened our eyes and saw nothing but blessings just dumping on us. I opened my eyes, and there was Herbert and Velma and my grandma Hattie, a slave in Chesterfield County who finished Hampton in 1882, smiling on me. How in the world could I lose? Taught me how to read and sing four-part harmony before I ever got to school. Taught me how to play the clarinet and the piano. Made me go to Sunday school. Daddy didn't send us. Daddy took us to Sunday school. If there was nobody in the Sunday school but one person, that would have been my daddy with his little 6 children there in the Sunday school at the Bank Street Back. That's what I inherited. I didn't earn it. You can't get that with a Visa card. It was given to me. Now, all through my neighborhood, there were other young fellas. I can remember all of them. Daddies were drunk half the time. They didn't read in their homes. Nobody went to Sunday school. None of that. They started life beneath the scratch line. I started life way above the scratch line. Everywhere I went, somebody said, "Aren't you Miss Hattie's grandson? Are you Herbert's boy?" Skipped 3 grades. I never was in the 3rd grade, the 5th grade, or the 7th grade. Everything smiling on me. Finished high school at 15, went on to college on a scholarship. None of that did I deserve. I hadn't earned any of it. I started out with a head of steam. Old Norfolk Mission College there had trained my mother and father. They had learned poetry, Paul Laurence done by Alfred Lord Tennyson, and they gave all of that to us in great abundance. And my buddies up the street had none of that. Now, if we want these bones to live again, those of us who have inherited benefits that we did not earn or deserve need to turn around and help those who inherited deficits that they did not earn or deserve, and help them to rise up to the scratch line where we are, so that they may earn and enjoy all of the benefits that we so take for granted. Can these bones live again, O Lord? Thou knowest, these bones can live.
Watch why Japanese people eat.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you. And if we can go back to the slides.
Whoops.
So you hear that raspy voice that Dr. Proctor had, and it's not a stained glass voice, but it's a very comforting and winsome voice that helps us become engaged with, enchanted almost by his rhetoric. If you could go to slide 17.
Am I there?
There we go. And so let's talk about Dr. Proctor's significance. He is obviously someone with a high purpose in a hurry. He graduates from high school 15. He's college president at age 34. And look at what he does in a 5-year period of his life. He's speechwriter for Hubert Humphrey, his presidential campaign. He's dean at the University of Wisconsin. He's professor at Rutgers University. He succeeds Adam Clayton Powell as senior pastor at Abyssinian Baptist Church. He's a college president over his whole career twice. 3 times he's a congregational pastor, and 3 times he's a professor. And he's engaged for social transformation initiated by agencies in the United States 5 different times. So he is in a hurry. He has, as one of his mentees called it, the 4 arrows in the quiver of his legacy. He described these as his in the homiletical quiver that he carried around. By the way, this is a picture of him at Abyssinian Baptist Church with everybody. I think this is also a high Sunday, fancy flowers behind him, and he's probably coming to the climactic moment of his sermon. His son, when he was being introduced at Abyssinian, I think it was Stephen, it could have been Samuel. They asked his dad what his hobby was. And he goes, "Oh, daddy's hobby is preaching." Daddy's hobby is preaching. But this mentee of his applied these 4 arrows as the quiver of his entire legacy: intellectual excellence. And he gets this from his parents and his grandparents. Cultural relevancy. And he gets this from the church. Spiritual integrity. And he gets this from a spiritual and interspiritual component that all of us have, but not in all of us is it quickened, is it inspirited, but in him it was. This spiritual integrity, meaning he needed to have his actions in his life, in his faith, match what he really believed inside. And then he was socially honest. And he gets this from his own fundamental maturity as a human being. Next slide. Now, these are, I believe, the foundations of Dr. Proctor's impactful journey. And this is my interpretation, and only take it as such. This doesn't come from Adam Bond. It doesn't come from the mentee. It doesn't come from anybody at the Proctor conference. It comes from my observation, reading, listening, praying, and trying to understand Dr. Proctor and his impact on all of us. These are the foundation stones: family, which means that he got comfort and encouragement. He got inoculated, but he was never insulated. Meaning in the Jim Crow South, which is where Norfolk, Virginia was, and in the midst of a pretty racist society. Remember, he's born in 21, and he sees there are more lynchings in the 1920s than in any decade in American history. They would put a flag out in Harlem, I believe in Harlem, but it was at the NAACP headquarters. Another lynching today, when a lynching was reported. But he was inoculated, but he wasn't insulated. He knew what was going on, but he got encouragement and comfort from his family. Education was absolutely key. This was drummed into him by his family, and he believed it and he lived it, that this was the key to opening any door, and that there was learning, and then there was also unlearning. He talked about how his faith was kind of picked apart. His understanding of the Bible was demolished when he went to seminary, but it got put back together eventually in a very good and integral way. He believed in institutions. He had, as they said about him at Abyssinian, he had a low-key approach, and he engaged in quiet activism. And the church was the basis for the firm grip on the real reality. That's a Maya Angelou term. The world does not tell us who we are or whose we are. The church did help him understand. Basic beliefs, the next slide. And I'll only highlight 3 of these. Planet Earth is good and gracious as a gift from God's generous hand. And this is against fundamentalism that thinks that this world is dirty, is tainted, is evil. No. Planet Earth is a good gift. God grants human beings real freedom and the power to choose. We make our own mess, that's the way he would say it. God does not will degradation. We do that. And also, Jesus is the paradigm of human possibilities. He described Jesus as inexhaustible love. And I love the quote at the bottom. We are all vessels of clay, derivative, finite creatures, but we are not here alone. I won't talk about all of these estimations. You can read them. A mighty oak has fallen. This is what Gardner Taylor talked about. His writings and sermons grounded me, says Marion Wright Edelman. His realism awed her, his infinite optimism and faith, and he never failed to make me laugh. More estimations of Dr. Proctor. Bill Moyers thought so highly of him, he wrote an introduction to one of his books. David Buttrick said the real secret was that he was a true gospeler. He hands out hope. This picture here is him speaking actually to the choir behind him at Abyssinian in New York. And then this is my final estimation of him. Some souls enter space and time with such effervescence and power, with such quintessential distinction and impact that after their earthly ships have steered toward their final harbors, the wake they leave after they have passed touches shoreline after shoreline with hardly any indication of ceasing. Such a soul was and is Samuel DeWitt Proctor. And then we got to look at his impact. These are the people he impacted. There's Dr. King, Dr. McMichael, Dr. Calvin Butts. There's Marion Wright Edelman, Jesse Jackson, Jeremiah Wright in the middle, one of the founders of the Proctor Conference. And here's Governor Wilder, who was a student at Virginia Union when Dr. Proctor was president, and also the current president, or the then president of Virginia Union. He had come back for a commencement. By the thousands, go back to that quote by Dr. McMichael. By the thousands, there are people who feel he made the decisive impact in their lives. He helped probably 150 people become institutional leaders and professors in his work at Rutgers. Is amazing, his impact. And also his impact at Abyssinian, of course. Next slide. And here he is on his installation Sunday in 1972 with his two children from the second half of his parenthood. The 164th anniversary of this church. The church was built in 1808, by the way. And it had been founded in the Wall Street area, then moved up to Harlem. And this was not a church that these black folks, these Baptists had bought on the cheap. They built it from the ground up. And this is him. I thought you'd get a better picture of the immensity of this congregation, of the sanctuary. You see the Proctor Institute. It's now called the Prathia Hall Samuel Proctor Institute for Child Advocacy Ministry. And that happens at the Haley Farm under the Children's Defense Fund. The slide, if you enlarge it, you can see all the details of that. I'm sorry it's so small. The Proctor Conference goes on and on every year. Virginia Union Seminary changed their name to the Proctor School of Theology. Here's his impact on A&T University in North Carolina is evident. His participation in the Peace Corps, his leadership there, and then the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Institute at Rutgers. He believed in institutions and in their impact and importance in our society. So, comments, questions, discussion, alternative suggestions?
I had a real quick question. What's Abyssinian?
Abyssinian, I tried to indicate at the very beginning, is a word that used to be called, that now would be called Ethiopia. Abyssinian is another name for that culture, that tradition, that legacy. And how did that church come to that title? That's the more pressing question for me. And it's answered in this way. When the church was moving up to Harlem, there were some immigrants from Ethiopia that were coming to church there. And the whole church thought that they would honor the Abyssinians, if you will, and name the church Abyssinian Baptist Church to honor their fortitude, their incredible faithfulness, and to memorialize that they had been part of the church. But it was also to take pride that they came from someplace. They didn't come over on the Mayflower. They came over on slave ships, but they survived that. They not only survived, they thrived. And this is the current pastor. And you can hear, he's on the right, and I forgot his name. He came from Philadelphia. And he is a powerful preacher. And there we go. That's a great picture from the balcony.
Anthony, did you have a question about one of the pictures on the slides?
Yeah, I just wondered if that was H.B. Charles and the left side of the photo of all the ministers there.
It was I think it was the slide before we went to the books.
I don't think so, Anthony.
See Freddie Haynes, but I thought that was H.B. Charles at the left, the bottom left.
I will see. This is on one of the slides, right? Let me see here.
It was the last slide before the books. That one. Nope. Go back.
It's the one that they're like on a podium somewhere, but there's like probably 20.
Right there.
Yeah.
At the bottom right. Nope.
That could be. I believe you might be right. Yep.
Oh, you're right once today.
Oh, someone's keeping track.
And yes, Anthony does have titles for his sermons,
Oh, I do.
in case you wondered.
Yeah. I think I've noticed that.
Yeah.
So at any rate, I think that Dr. Proctor is one of the neglected geniuses of American history and certainly of American Christianity. And while he is not steeped in mysticism and the erudition of a quiet spirit, he has many qualities that we need to emulate these days. He had incredible enthusiasm for people and for the Bible and how the Bible and people could connect in ways that could be healing and empowering. But also he wasn't, he was open to things that would lead to new knowledge. And this comes from his family. You need to understand, and he learned this in seminary. You didn't just go in and start talking about Noah and the ark. You had to understand all of the cultures that surrounded the Old Testament, as we call it, the Hebrew Bible. You needed to know all of those ites that are referenced again and again in the Hebrew Bible, and what the Babylonian captivity. You needed to know Greco-Roman culture to understand New Testament history and the New Testament itself. So anyway, I just think that his legacy is profound. I don't know of anybody who has a seminary named after them who was a preacher after World War II. There are several Black seminaries that were named after their founders or after great preachers. But this does not normally happen in American history as a general rule. Anyway, so, and I'm not sure that there's a doctoral program that has produced as many great D-Min graduates as the Proctor Fellows program at United in Dayton, Ohio.
Robert, how would you compare Thurman and Proctor? That might be.
They were sources of wisdom, counsel, and encouragement for everybody that was in the civil rights movement. Did they lead the charge? No. He was president when students were doing sit-ins in downtown Greensboro in North Carolina. He had to go get the bail money to get them out of jail. All right. He tells a very funny story of being at a big posh meeting of college presidents, and they were using fine china. They had 5-inch thick carpet. He paints a really pretty picture. And then one person after another gets a call about how all over the South, and these are HBCU folk gathering, all these college presidents are getting call after call after call about their campuses generating one sit-in and also arrest of student body presidents after another, after another, after another. So he had a different role to play than a leader in the civil rights movement, but he was certainly a counselor to it all along the way. I want to turn to that quote. What did you think of that scratch line video?
Oh,
I
I
loved
love
it.
that.
Yeah.
Was that not wonderful?
Oh,
Yeah.
it's good to hear his voice.
And what I think one of the most important lines in that 2-minute excerpt is where he said, "We who have been blessed to live above the scratch line
Yeah.
need to help those who are below, and we who did not deserve being born above it need to help those who were born below the scratch line, which they also did not deserve."
Absolutely.
That is excellent.
So that's justice, by the way. That's what justice means. When you can get people all on the same side, the good side of the scratch line.
Yeah.
I know that
What is a scratch line?
Well, you know what? I think it's
Or
kind
that.
of like, when you're in your home, some people let these little leaded pencil marks remain year after year after year. I don't know if Anthony does this with his children, or if Wilma did it with you and your sisters, but where you mark how high, how tall they are,
Yeah.
and then you go above that. Well, the thesis is that hopefully you'll continue to grow. And that's a good thing, right?
Well, and that's
I
where the
think that,
start from scratch came from.
Oh, good.
so I think that that's the reference, but I have searched in rhetoric, in history, and have no final idea. It's something that I had to extract and assume. So unless somebody has that idea, that I'd love to learn what that means. But
Well, I think I've grown up hearing you start from scratch, meaning you're starting from nothing. You start with whatever you have and that's it. Yeah.
maybe
starting from
that's
scratch.
it. Maybe that's it.
I don't know where that phrase came from, but that was a phrase that I was told.
Probably back in 1823 in somebody's out of date and
Yeah.
no longer published periodical. Anyway, so
It was amazing.
So Bob, this is Margaret. You're a gem, by the way. We appreciate you. And if you go to Little Rock, be sure you go to the Clinton Library. It looks like a giant mobile home off the
Yes.
highway.
I will look at that. I have been there once.
Oh, have you?
Priscilla and I went there, and we went to 2 places. And I'm past this having any consequence for me. We went to a place that had 150 kinds of bourbon at it. We went to that bar.
Ooh,
And
cool.
then we went to the presidential
You did go.
library
Okay.
for Bill.
Well, I lived in that way for 11 years, so.
After the bourbon.
Any rate, but I really I'm thinking about going. I don't know.
6.5
We'll see.
hours.
I noticed when he was talking about the scratch line, he never mentioned, that I can recall, he did not mention race. He just talked about
Oh, people.
The guys down the street.
the guys down the street.
Exactly.
He never mentioned.
No.
And for me, that it moved me quite deeply. I just, gosh, if everyone could see that video.
Yep.
And
Let me,
I think
yes.
it's meaningful. I think it's particularly meaningful for him as a Black man to make that
And it's so
observation.
simple.
Yeah.
Let me tell you, he has an an address at Shaw University, and he tells two stories about how he heard about Dr. King's assassination. He was in a cab in Dallas, and he paints this pretty pathetic picture of a white guy with scrawny, long hair, with tattoos crawling up his arm, with a burnout cigarette on his lip, and how when he picked him up at the airport in Dallas and was taking him to his hotel, he said, "Did you hear? Did you hear?" And he says, "No, they killed Martin Luther King in Memphis today. They killed him." And so Sam doesn't hear it from Coretta Scott King, doesn't hear it from Will Campbell, doesn't hear it from Gardner Taylor, doesn't hear it from Benjamin Mays. He hears it from a scrawny, cigarette-lipped, tattooed white guy that was skinny and bedraggled, his cab driver, who was shaking when he told him. And he was shaking so much, he had to pull the car over to the side. And Dr. Proctor says, "What did you say?" And he says, "They killed Dr. King." And when he got to his hotel room, he raises his hand. He says, "Mike," that was his, given name when he was born. "Mike, you will never believe who told me how your life has impacted this white cab driver in Dallas."
Wow.
So then he tells another story about a man who was getting Dr. King some life insurance. He was a white guy, 70 years old Southern white guy. But he said, "Boy, this young man he's in danger." He went to him all at his various venues where he was speaking and preaching, and he tried to get in. They said, "Get away, old white guy, get away." And he called up Proctor and he says, "Sam, I want to make sure," and this is through the American Baptist Missionary Retirement Fund. He says, "We've got some money to give a life insurance program to Dr. King, because I'm not sure that he has this. I don't know if he makes enough money to do this, but we can do this for him." And finally, Proctor called up Andy Young and said, "Hey, when he comes to him," called up Wyatt T. Walker, who had been a student of his at Virginia Union, and he says, "Let him in the door and let him talk to Dr. King. He wants to give him this life insurance policy," which they did. And then 4 years after that, not 4 years, 4 months, he was assassinated.
Oh, divine.
And he talked about the importance of this white guy in the South making sure that Coretta had a pension for the rest of her life.
There is hope in the world, isn't there?
There always has been.
He was, as he said, he handed out hope.
Yeah.
So we're at our time, and that's never a surprise. So just a quick comment. Bob, do you have a quick, two things. Do you have a quick reflection on Jimmy Carter? And then I'm hoping maybe Anthony could close us out with prayer.
Well, I'm in need of Anthony's prayer for sure, as we all are. President Carter needs to be reassessed. Not only was he shall we say, the greatest ex-president in the history of that office in American life, he lived during modern medical technology so he could keep his health, and he kept it till he was 100. But he also had an inner purpose. It wasn't just medical technology that kept him alive. His own inner compass, his spiritual integrity, to borrow this phrase that we've used for Dr. Proctor, was also extant. It was in existence in President Carter. He really did live and walk what he spoke and taught in his entire life. And I think that he will be remembered for that. But also, there needs to be a re-examination of the last 2 months of his presidency. He got more done in that last 2 months as a lame duck after the election pronounced his defeat and that he would no longer be able to have a second term. He got more done during that time frame than maybe any other president in the history of the office. And they were lasting things and good things. So I think it's interesting that his funeral brings together opponents and heated, and some might say opponents that trafficked in some mutual disdain for each other, certainly from one side. And I think it's very interesting that they were all brought together there at the National Cathedral. I think that's noteworthy.
It was also interesting to me, all of the pomp and circumstance afforded him as a former president. That is not how he lived his life.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I thought about
He was a simple.
I mean, you don't think of him as being a naval officer, and yet he was granted full military honors because he was, you know.
Well, and he studied with under one of the great nuclear submarine
My favorite
wizards.
story was the one his grandson told him about his cell phone. When he was, what are you doing? You called me. No, I'm not. I'm taking a picture. And he turns to the side and he says, he was a nuclear scientist. I loved it. He and I then are a lot alike, right?
Yeah.
All right.
Fully embraced your text messages.
Thank you.
By the way, it should be, this is self-referential and kind of self-congratulatory, at least congratulating Liz and your class. This is a Sunday school class that we're in the middle of. And our being in the middle of it is tribute enough for President Carter. He was a Sunday school teacher longer than he was ever president.
From World War II to COVID.
Yes,
Yep.
can you believe that?
Just to put it in.
Kelly
that
was
text.
90. I still have something to look for. Oh, never mind.
That's right.
You want to close us out with prayer, Anthony?
I gotta go.
Oh, yes.
Absolutely. Let us pray. God, we thank you. We thank you for what you so consistently do. And that is send your angels to us, to guide us, to lead us, to show us you. And God, we just take a moment to pause in this Sunday school and we cover and extend our prayer to our friend and brother, Reverend Hill. We are thankful for him. We're thankful for his diligent studies,
Yes.
his desire to share great souls and great prayers with all of us. God, we ask you to just reignite him and catapult him to a further space, even beyond what he desires, God. We ask you to take his voice to the nations. And we ask you right now, God, to promote him to a space that folks would remember him like these great souls that he remembers today. Now, God, as we move forward, we ask that you would help us to remember these stories and the lives of these people so well lived that they might not be forgotten or overlooked, that we would go home and further study their lives and legacies, and that we would apply their practices aligned with your word to our lives, that we might be able to ultimately lead someone to you, to ask that question, what can I do to be saved? It is in the name of Jesus that we pray. And we ask you for a great year ahead for First Christian and all those who are part of this ministry. It is in Jesus' name we thank you and we praise you. Amen.
Amen.
I don't know about you, Bob, but he about made me cry.
We can all use prayers like that. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you.
Happy New Year, Bob.
And Happy New Year. And thank you to you all. And bless you on the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Be safe.
I'm gonna go home and eat.